in this day and age where we just idolize entrepreneurship, and probably a little bit too much, what I think is so impressive and exciting about your career, Beth, is that you have been a real pioneer in the enterprise, and you were at GE for how many years?
Yeah, 27 years.
Which is crazy.
That counts the NBC years, but yeah.
But it's all under the same umbrella.
It's all under the same umbrella.
And if you think about how 50 years ago the average life expectancy of a Fortune 500 company was 75 years, and now it's less than 15.
Yeah.
It's not easy to innovate in that kind of an environment.
Yeah, I mean, that's a sobering number, isn't it? I think most of us, you think these companies, 125-year-old companies, are everywhere. They're really not.
And isn't GE the only one that's really been on, from the very beginning, on the stock exchange?
Yeah, and no, it's no longer, even because of the year it's had, it's not even on the Dow anymore. So that was always something at GE we held up, like, see, we're the original company still on the Dow, but they can't even say that anymore. It's like that.
It started about a year and a half ago when she left. I don't know.
It's all totally related. Absolutely all related.
So I'm really excited about hearing about the successes and also the failures, and I think that's the seamy underbelly of entrepreneurship, and the book is filled with those stories, and we'll talk a little bit about it.
Well, one of the things, I called it Imagine It Forward, but I jokingly with my editor said we should call it Fail Forward. I was kind of joking, not really, and I think he was worried about that, but I tried to channel that because I think especially in established companies, failure is a bad word.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about that, because I think that in some ways it's almost a cliche that you should fail now, right?
I know.
But the truth is that I think one of the projects that you really spearheaded that I was the most excited about was objectively maybe a big failure on paper was Quirky.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, first of all, what Quirky is and why you were so interested in it. And maybe you can take us back to the moment that you launched it to the company.
So Quirky, it's still around, but at the time it was this hot startup. They had raised, just record amounts of funding to do basically open source innovation. And Ben Kaufman founded. He was a serial entrepreneur, and he basically went to the community, and they came up with ideas. And then his team was really good at doing it fast, getting it into the market, and making amazing things. We came to him because we were looking for new methods of manufacturing. We were really early seeing how manufacturing was changing. We also were excited about the digitization of industry, and we had this vision with him of creating consumer-based connected devices. So we were early, and we started on a great journey, and it went well until suddenly Quirky went bankrupt. Mm-hmm. And all the energy we put into it, all the funding that I had backed, with the company just went up in smoke. There was a lot of good that came out of it. I mean, we originally did it to apply it to our appliance business, and there was a lot of tension in that, but in the end, they took some of those methods and created, if you go to Louisville today, something called First Build, which is open source manufacturing in the community of Louisville, where they're bringing in people from all over the world to kind of do limited run manufacturing. So I can point to that as a success that came out of the failure, but boy, did that hurt, and was it tough, and it was a lot of just seeing that this could happen, but so much is out of your control. I mean, we weren't running Quirky, he was. We were creating this new business line together. I think one of my lessons is big companies throw a lot of money at ideas, often too early, but so do startups. And I think most people imagine that startups are always just scrappy. Because they were so well funded, they weren't as focused as they needed to be, and Ben took on too many things and ultimately took on too much debt, and he couldn't sustain the model.
I've heard it called the Taj Mahal syndrome.
Oh, is that right? Have you?
A long time ago, back when I was starting my first company, actually, companies that had too much money, they just would take it for granted, and they wouldn't be scrappy, and they wouldn't be resourceful enough.
Yeah. I think there's a real lesson in that, and most people think by nature, if you're a startup, that you have to be scrappy, but some companies, people just can't help but give you money.
So describe your role a little bit at GE, and it really changed. You were the first CMO in decades at the company, and then you've evolved into vice chair, and most recently vice chair and head of business innovation. So what does that mean? And what is a CMO, actually? What is a CMO doing in a manufacturing company?
Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of people asking that. If I take you back, I was the first chief marketing officer in 20 years. And Jeff Emmett had just come in as CEO, and he had this vision of we're going to kind of grow organically, grow from within. And he had started in the team that I ended up leading. Corporate marketing was a starting point. And he basically said, hey, he looked around, he said, hey, we're going to innovate, we're going to be more global, we're going to get closer to customers. I need you to help us figure out where we're going in the world. That was about it. Like, this is marketing. And in a company, an enterprise company at that point, marketing was what you did at the end. It still is, unfortunately. It's often in too many companies. It's the ads you do, it's the trade shows you put together. The opportunity that pretty quickly the teams and I grabbed was actually marketing is what you do at the beginning. It's where the world's going. You're the GPS of the organization. It's the insights. And I took my job really seriously. It was about living in the market. Okay, when you live in the market, you see change, you see trends, you get excited. And from there, it's a pretty, may not make sense, but to me, it's a pretty easy journey to say from there, you become about change and innovation. And so I think if we, seeded anything in the company from that perspective, it was market-back innovation. So we were constantly, fighting is a strong word, but constantly there was a tension between the technologists who innovate because they can, because they have great science and they should, and us representing another group of people that innovated because the trends were going there. We saw opportunity early, and it created a lot of tension in the company, but I think it was good.
Tell me about what that was like, and I'm sure there are times when you were not very popular in the
Most times I wasn't popular, and I like to be liked, so that was often difficult, and I'm by nature more shy and quiet and reserved, so I had to, my style was more to stand back, be the observer in GE, but outside GE, I had to learn to be kind of a relentless networker, explorer.
Yeah, it surprised me when I read in the book that you're sort of introverted, because that's not the view. That's what the Beth that I
You would have seen me in places where we would have met, where I would have hopefully tapped into my curiosity and come up and said, Z, like, what are you doing? Let me learn about manufacturing, or, all the different things you were working on. And I realized the company I worked for was so insular. And I actually think most of business today is so insular, that it was an easy role for me to have as the one who went outside to see what's next, to see what's new, because no one was doing it. And so that kind of became my calling card. And
it's great because you have the brand, you have the resources behind you. And so that really opens doors, and I think there's a lot of value to that.
Yeah, but I mean, GE was also cheap. I mean, big brand doesn't mean you have a big budget. And so a lot of it was just early discovery, hunches, what's out there. And I try to put out in the book, I think every company needs to make room for discovery. To me, it's like one of the joys of working and life. But people need to make more room to get out and see what's next and what's new. And we always think that's for someone else. Let's hire a consultant. We don't have time. I like this challenge of saying, can you take 10% of your time and devote it to discovering something new and next? And I pretty much live my life that way.
How do you find discipline around that?
Well, I just do it. I make sure I schedule time, whether it's reading, like tomorrow I'm heading out and I'll be in yet another airport, and I always like to go to the newsstand for as long as they last and pick up a magazine that's crazy. I've actually challenged a few people. I met someone the other day and she told me she picked up a wrestling magazine. I was very proud of her. I think I remember picking up a backpacking magazine. So I try to, wherever I am, I try to find something new and different. I keep a notebook around, kind of interestingness, things of interest.
What's the strangest thing you've seen recently?
Oh, I'm trying to think of something really. I was just. I think one of the trends I'm just been tracking. One is just the return to analog in a way that I think more and more I'm seeing that, where people are opting out of a digital life. I'm seeing a lot of interesting startup ideas where people are creating analog experiences, hotels where you can't find them online, you can't take any Instagram photos when you're there. Yep. So that's one that I'm kind of interested in.
You mentioned getting out and exploring different things. One of the trips that you took that struck me was going to Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
And why did you do that, and what did you learn when you were there?
Yeah, well, we had a hunch. We were trying to figure out our way in digital health, and I had just come back from NBC and was all hepped up on digital, and we knew that at the time, it was right after the Arab Spring, and in the Middle East especially, the governments were putting a lot of money to healthcare, because it was a way to provide sort of stability in a society. So we kind of knew that from a trend. I was one of the first women at the time to go into Saudi for my company. And I remember I was planning to go, and one of my colleagues, one of the women who was an executive, she said, oh, I never go to Saudi. I don't like the way they treat women. Well, I didn't like the way they treated women either, but I needed to go see for myself. So I go in August, and like, you know, all the abaya and everything, it was like 900 degrees. But it was the most fascinating trip I'd ever done in business because I had to go see for myself. And when we got there, we arranged meetings with amazing women. Amazing women. Just by the nature that I was a woman and there were women there, I got to see a whole new world open up that the company might not otherwise have seen. And we started unpacking it and were able to come up with a whole health program. We were able to uncover that women were dying at alarming rates of stage 4 breast cancer. And so we put a team together and we came up with a whole new mammography unit.
So why were they dying of cancer?
Because they thought cancer was a curse. And they didn't want to acknowledge that they were sick. And so one of the first things we did is we came up with a program with the government, the Saudi government, where we created digital avatars. And we basically said to women, hey, come online. You don't have to reveal who you are. You can have total anonymity. And then you can go and ask questions about cancer, and it expanded to a lot of different things. But you only would know that by being there, by having a team that went in and asking those kind of questions. So I think there are a lot of things that companies take for granted, and you got to go see for yourself.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about what you think about the future of manufacturing and the opportunities there. And I'm saying that because I think that a lot of people focus too much only on the digital side and don't realize that, and that's one of the things that really struck me, is GE had such a forward-thinking way, or at least the view from the outside of thinking about manufacturing. So what were the opportunities that you saw, and what are the things that need to happen? What stories do people have to believe for that to actually come true?
Well, one, I think there's just, for anyone who's in manufacturing, most of the people have a real passion for making things. And again, that was another discovery we led starting in our own place. Right after the financial crisis, we were getting out of capital. We were retuning ourselves as more of a manufacturing company. But it occurred to me that a lot of us hadn't really understood the mind of the manufacturer. And it's amazing when you go out and you walk the floor and you start talking to people and you understand the hacking that they do. I remember one guy, we went into one of the factories and he brought his gun to work because he didn't like the machinery, I guess he must have gotten some special permit, but he didn't like the way one of the machines tested something. And so he brought his gun and created something to like test the tensile strength of a metal or something. So you saw people who were just very creative, very craftsman-like, men and women. I'm saying that in a very broad sense. And so I think that's the thing people miss about manufacturing, is that for all the tech, there's still, I could show you a jet engine that starts with a guy who brings out an X-Acto knife, and he actually carves something by hand, and then it becomes something very high-tech. So I think people don't appreciate that there's both the human touch and the high-tech in many of these processes.
And I mentioned the story. What story do we need to believe for it to happen? I just remember this particular character in your book that came in, and he had a French name. I don't remember what it was. But he had this, he was talking about the reptilian part of the brain and how we need to hear the story in order for something to come true. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
I hired this, it was early on in my career, I hired this crazy Frenchman. His name's Clotaire Rapaille, and he was a cultural anthropologist. And he was we were trying to just figure out our way. It was a new leadership team had come in, Jeff Immelt had taken over. Who are we in the world? Jack Welch had left the building. Who are we? And so most people would call McKinsey. I had met this guy at a P&G sponsored meeting, and P&G had hired him, so I thought, good enough for P&G. And I really loved his thought about neuroscience, but he was unconventional in a GE context. First, he wore a black velvet cape, which was very unusual for the kind of consultants we had at GE. Probably the only consultant to date that's ever worn a black cape. I feel safe to say. And he had this belief of really, he kind of went through the three parts of the brain, your reptilian, your emotional, and your logical brain. And he had this process to do research that just took people through a process. We'd have people lying on the floor, crying, talking about their first experience with GE. I mean, it was pretty profound. The process, his results were okay. His view was, I'll come out with a code. And so his thing was study, and he'd give you this magic word like here's my gift to you. And for us, it was like, after 6 months, he came and said, you're the Marines. It's like, what? We're the Marines? Like, you've been 6 months, like, that's the best you can do? But we're a big company, we're American, okay, we're the Marines. But what it did for us is it helped us pull a team together that unpacked where we came from. We really sort of rediscovered Thomas Edison in our heritage. That was our story.
The process was so important.
And the discovery of where you came from, needing to understand that to know where you're going to go. And if we were going to be about technology, it was about unlocking that inner innovator, and we could say, hey, we were part of Edison's legacy. And so he helped us unlock that, even if it was non-traditional and the code didn't really mean anything. We kind of said, okay, we're Edison's Marines, whatever that means. But out of that came in a really, for me, an unlocking of just the value of imagination at work, why imagination has been a through line for me. Because our challenge at the company at the time was it was right post Six Sigma, which had been an amazing quality program in GE. It was Jack Welch's legacy.
Describe a little bit how Six Sigma
So Six Sigma in manufacturing parlance is basically you're trying to get rid of defects so that the quality of your product is great. And a defect is bad. I mean, trust me, if you're flying in a jet engine, they are virtually defect-free, and that's good. But for us humans, defects are good. It makes us innovative. We come up with new ideas. And the company everybody had to be certified in Six Sigma. I was at NBC and I was certified. I had like a green belt or something. And it was really dumb. I mean, we did all sorts of Gantt charts and process flow charts to tell us how to mail our envelopes better at NBC or something. I don't know. And so I came into that culture, and what I felt it did a bit was it kind of squeezed the imagination out of a lot of people. Everybody wanted the perfect process. They wanted a checklist for efficiency. And I've only seen that grow in businesses that I've known, and I don't think you have to have gone through Six Sigma to see that's kind of the world we live in now.
It almost feels like it's innate, or at least for me, even though people say that I'm innovative, at the same time I feel like I'm a perfectionist, so that it's this battle.
It is a battle, isn't it?
Because how do you take risks, and how do you try new things and iterate if you're afraid of that?
Yeah.
If you always
But
want to
that's
be perfect.
it, and that's what I think we're facing in all of our companies, and most of our companies, certainly the more established ones, and I think even some of the newer companies, we could have a debate about that. But I call it the imagination gap, which is, I think, this just dark place where possibility and ideas go to die because we're afraid of trying things. We've basically squeezed the imagination and the ability to take risk because we want to be perfect. We want certainty, short-termism. It's not just businesses, it's government, it's education.
Absolutely.
I mean, really, we have a crisis of short-term thinking right now, I think.
How do we get out of that?
Well, but I think we have to encourage people to take risks. I've been doing informal research. There are a lot of studies out there about kids today that feel high rates of anxiety, depression. One of the factors when you talk to teachers is they're afraid to try things. Teachers are saying their kids are afraid to try things because they're afraid they're not going to be successful. So somehow, like the fast pace, the pressure.
You know what kind of drives me crazy though? I had this experience. I was in Boston at the New England Aquarium, and I saw this kid just completely engrossed in this clownfish exhibit, and at the time I was really, really into scuba diving, so I knew everything about clownfish.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it was cool.
Yeah.
And he had a question, and in fact, I think the answer was probably right above it, right? And he was probably 4 years old, and he asked his dad this question, and the dad obviously didn't know the answer because he said something totally wrong, because he wasn't willing to say, I don't know.
I don't know.
And I'm thinking, how do we expect our kids to learn how to learn and ask questions and be curious if we don't model it? Not just parents, but teachers too. The adults feel like they always have to have the answers.
Exactly, and I think that's our challenge in business. That's what I came to appreciate, is that people ask questions to prove what they know, not to learn. Simple questions that scientists know, but we don't bring them into business enough. This idea of just, what's your hypothesis? It gets you off the hook. You don't have to have the answer.
Yeah.
And I think things like that are really missing. I used to have these fantasies of the training programs that we could do in my company. One was that we would take a group of people and just drop them somewhere in the middle of America. I don't know, pick Akron. We just drop them off in Akron and take away their phones, and maybe you'd give them.
Oh my God! Now you're getting everyone nervous, right?
And you'd say you got to figure your way back. You got to find your way out of here. No one's going to give you the answer. You got to figure your way out. Well, you know that would never happen. Legal would be in there.
Right.
Everybody would tell you 5 reasons why that couldn't happen. I don't know. Maybe people would never get out of Akron because they don't know what to do. But I think that's what we have to do.
New headquarters.
Exactly. New headquarters is Akron. Why? Because we couldn't leave.
How did you change the culture? And was it big changes? Was it small changes? What were some of the moments where you were a bit worried about your future because you were pushing too hard?
Yeah, well, I think there's a worried about my personal future and a worried about the company's future. And for me, I'll give you an example of that. It might have been in clean tech, because we were pretty early to clean tech in industry and really pushed that. And people were fearful, partly because centralized utility, it seemed like renewable seemed a cartoon, silly. So there was a lot of tension in that.
What year was this?
That would have been around 2003 to 2005. And there was tension in it because we didn't want to get ahead of our customers. Tension because we had fought the EPA over some stuff that had been in GE's past. So a lot of fear is what I came to learn in those situations. And so you're coming in saying, no, but like wind and solar. I feel like solar I never quite broke through. And people got tired of hearing from me. And the answer was always, yeah, but how will we make money? Yeah, but how will we make money? And so you start to see these defenses, and really what you want is just a little bit of freedom to test something, to try it. And ultimately, I worked with a team that was able to prove they could be profitable in solar. But then you need to go beyond that. And so what you're trying to do is build a bit of momentum and a bit of a movement. But yeah, you have to keep going back at it, and people have to say, oh, that's stupid, or you don't know what you're talking about. I've been in this business for 30 years. You don't know what you're talking about. Well, you don't know this space. And you have to just keep coming back. You have to do your homework, right? Yeah. But you build this, for me it was a resilience, not because I was right, but I could just, because I was out in the world hanging around people like you and others who saw things, I felt confident this world was going this way. It wasn't like I saw the future.
How do you balance confidence and humility in that kind of a situation where you go into a place where you're not the expert, you haven't been doing it for a long time?
Yeah. Well, I think you just have passion in what you've seen outside there. You just believe you've seen enough trends, patterns, you've talked to enough people that say something's happening here.
So being assertive is good.
I think you ask questions. What would happen if this happened? How might we think about this? I love scenario planning for that, just to start to, one of my favorites these days is, imagine a constant, now imagine if it went away, and what would you do? Think back 10 years ago, something that seemed really weird, that now's mainstream.
Like getting into a stranger's car?
Yeah, exactly. That's a good one. That's a good one. Craft beer,
Yeah.
I mean, so I always like to use those examples when people say, well, that's not going to happen, and then go, well, okay, but remember back when craft beer seemed really weird?
I mean, literally, it was just over 10 years ago that the iPhone came out.
Yeah.
It's crazy to think it was 10 years ago this year.
Yeah.
And so I can't even imagine a life without it.
You can't, yeah. And things like that in an enterprise company, we would take the iPhone and say, okay, imagine your jet engine is tethered to an iPhone, only it's just for your customers. And so you use a lot of metaphor. You try to say, here's the iPhone platform. What might it be if we did it for rail, for an MRI? So it's a lot of metaphor and storytelling.
So you've had, and I've been in, not for nearly with the amount of time that you have and success, but in sort of bureaucratic organizations where you're the innovation person, and it's really important to have air cover from the CEO or the president or whoever, and I've done that in academia, and so you did have air cover from Jeff Immelt, the CEO, which
he was a great champion for the future and for me taking risks.
Yeah, and I wonder, but there were times when you didn't have that. When you were working at NBC Universal, it was a very different situation. What did you learn from that difference in culture? And you were pretty candid in the book, but nicely. But it was a different culture.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about that difference in culture and what that meant for the ability to innovate.
Yeah, I always say to people, I felt much more creative at GE than at NBC. And that's ironic given that NBC is a media entertainment company. But what I found in the media world, and especially when most of my time was at NBC, was that it was very much about me. And it was my team against yours. It was my cult of personality against yours. And so people would come together in a meeting. They were pleasant, very pleasant. They'd agree in a meeting, and then they would leave, and they would say, I'm never doing that. Are you kidding? I know I said yes, but there's no way. It's us against them. We're going to take her down. And so that's really hard to drive change in that.
Hard to stay sane.
Yeah, they called it, it's not very polite, but they called it the big grin fuck, because they would grin and then they'd stab you or whatever. And so that was the culture. The culture I came to appreciate at GE was, yes, you'd have your debate, but then a decision was made and everybody marched forward. It was very much a mission-based culture. You're talking about healthcare, aviation, energy. These were big world-changing missions, and people kind of got over, not that they liked everybody, but they got over it. So that was one thing I learned. I think having a champion is critical, but here's the thing. I had a great champion in Jeff Immelt, but I also had to push the boundaries of what he would champion. And so it's not like every day he was like, okay, what new thing would you like to do today? Here's a checkbook and just go. It was a lot of, yeah, but he always said no the first time, always. I don't care what it was. He never once said, yes, that's a good idea the first time, never. It was always, I had a 3-time rule with him. I had to go back 3 times. I think there was digital health thing we tried to launch. It took 6 years. And thanks to Sue Siegel, who we ended up hiring to lead ventures and innovation, she helped get it over the line. So like you have to have a champion, but you also have to push for that right to be championed, I think. And at NBC, people were too busy being their own little teams. And I shared in the book, because I was driving digital change and it was scary, this is what happens when it's us against them, and it happens too often in companies. But if any of you know the New York Post, it's a great gossip rag, still my must-read morning read. But page 6 is their gossip page. And one morning I pick up page 6, and there's a piece in there about me that said something to the effect of, she's so lethal, she'll take out your kidney and you don't even know it's gone. Well, in hindsight, I kind of take that as a compliment, but at the time it was devastating. And that's what was happening. It was a warring tribe inside, and people didn't like that we were making moves on digital and taking resources and turf. So they call up page 6 and say, she's a witch, she's horrible, she's going to lose her job. So it's hard to make change in those situations.
That's crazy. Do you think that that's inherent to entertainment industry?
I think it's inherent to human nature, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I think people are afraid. I think at the end of the day, I think we could somewhat look at that in society right now. People are afraid of the unknown, afraid of the pace of change. People are afraid of being left behind. And that was the situation at NBC. I saw it at digital at GE. And I, unfortunately, perpetuated this. And this is what I was trying to show a little bit. We were the cool kids. We were the digital. We were going to the future. It's like we had a secret and no one else knew. The words you use, the language, like, what, you just don't get it? And of course people feel upset, and you're taking away their resources, and you're calling them uninformed, and you're not letting them learn. So I was part of...
It sounds like we saw that recently in politics too.
But I think that's what we're dealing with, is how do we kind of bridge that divide? And I always felt my job was this outsider inside, but with that comes a responsibility of translating that. And I didn't always do that very well.
Yeah, that's tough. So we are in the epicenter of the entertainment industry, and LA is the largest manufacturing center in the country. And I'm wondering, given your background both in media and also in manufacturing, what can they learn from each other? What can manufacturing learn from media, and vice versa?
Well, I think manufacturing can learn from media the art of storytelling, because I think engineering, manufacturing, they don't often tell the story of what they're creating, why they're doing it, why it's relevant in the world. So I would send manufacturers to story school or story camp or something.
Actually, tomorrow we're doing one at Red Bull just down the street, which is kind of weird.
That's smart. I would, next time I'd love to go to one of those. I think the manufacturing people, I mean, I think the entertainment guys can learn from manufacturing. I do think they have craftsmanship in entertainment. I think there is a craftsmanship, so I think they probably have that in common. My guess is that would be a common bond for them. But I think that there's worthy work in making things, in doing things that are under the radar and kind of the behind the scenes stories of these things. I think people they don't appreciate that in manufacturing. You want to, to weld seems, I don't know, dirty or, so I think that they could learn a lot from the passion these people have for the work that they do. I think both of them are dealing with the same trend that we're all dealing with in the hyper-connected, digitized world, is much more distributed way they make movies and manufacturing. Think about it. You don't really have to be in LA anymore to make content.
Yeah.
You don't have to be in an LA manufacturing center or pick your, to be in manufacturing. You can be in Akron. I don't know. Maybe the headline of this is we're all going to move to Akron. The future is Akron.
Wasn't Akron the one they had this dispatch? I forgot whether it was in TechCrunch or something, where they had this field trip for all these Silicon Valley, luminaries, and they're all going and they're salivating over the really cheap rent and the, people that are like eager to work and all this talent and everything. And meanwhile on the bus they were feeding them like kombucha and kale, gluten-free pizza and all this stuff, like a safari. I mean, really.
I love that as an idea. I was in Silicon Valley recently. We had this discussion about the insular nature of Silicon Valley, and that's what you do. So I'm encouraged to hear that that's actually happening.
Maybe. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, did anyone come back? I don't know.
I don't know. So speaking about that craftsmanship and that kind of iterative nature, I was laughing when you mentioned that Jeff was a
serial iterator.
And I'm a little bit of that too, but I think that a lot of the tools that we have enable us to iterate like we haven't been able to before, and maybe in the physical realm too. So could you talk a little bit about what some of those tools were that were coming out, and also the whole idea of it was called Fastworks, I think, where you were working with Eric Ries, who was on Live Talks actually earlier this year.
Yeah, he's great.
Yeah,
so I think for us, Fastworks was just a way to move faster and be more sort of harness more of the entrepreneurial spirit that we needed in a big company. My thesis is everybody needs to be an entrepreneur. It's not just something relegated to a startup or Silicon Valley, and that came out of that. But minimally viable product out of lean startup, that was really helpful. It's just a prototype. It's just, hey, let's just test something. Let's test it with a customer.
But how do you do that with a jet engine?
Well, that was one of the questions that the jet engine folks had is, well, okay, you can do that in software, but you can never do that in hardware. You can do it with a business model. You can do it with a part. It ended up being the jet engine people ended up being the most innovative in testing, and they embraced 3D printing in metals, and have totally transformed the way they work by doing this iterative kind of test and learn in printing.
Because you have no tooling that you have to invest in when you do the 3D printing, so you can just do a little tweak and you can do one-off parts. But I think I remember also the story about how there was a jet engine that already existed, that if you just do a small tweak, all of a sudden it met these new requirements that you wanted to test. And so instead of 6 years, it would take 6 months.
Exactly. And so that was part of what we were doing, reducing the cycle time of these things by taking existing things and not over-engineering them. Just going and finding one customer, testing it, and going from there. Again, these are scrappy things that big companies forget. What do big companies do? They throw too much money at something at the wrong stage. They have too many bureaucratic checks along the way. They have too many people weighing in on, and we had to get rid of all of that kind of bureaucracy. I'd say the other tool I am crazy about, and it's simple, is just the notion of feedback and feedback loops. And just continually getting more ability to get feedback so you can move faster.
So how do you do that? Like, what are some of the tools?
Yeah, I'll give you one of them was we did away with the annual performance review. Think about it. You have to wait a year to hear from your manager that you're doing well or not. I mean, that's so 1950s. It's so horrible. But we still do it in companies
Surprise, you're
today.
getting fired.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or you have, you got to change your ways and you have a year to do it.
Right.
So we went into just more continuous feedback loops where anyone in the company could give anyone feedback. Suddenly you had an accountability loop. You knew where you stood at any moment with whatever issue you were. Things like that were really important to make change happen faster. Doing a lot of this with customers, prototyping with customers, setting up joint ventures with customers, investing in startups, partnering with startups, unlocking your own startup people. We created a drone business with a team that was already existing in the company, just no one had ever set them free.
You talk about gatekeepers. I think of the ultimate gatekeepers are in Hollywood, right? Like where they're like, oh, a few, executives are like, yes, green light, red light, whatever, and can't, we're not putting that on the air. And it feels like, meanwhile, just, YouTube and all these different channels are just completely passing them by. And what does that look like in a place like GE? And is there still a role for gatekeepers, or should they be completely eliminated?
Well, look, I think you still need constraints. I'm a big believer, because you don't have unlimited funds. Not every idea is a good one. The time isn't always right. So I do think you need that tension. Gatekeepers are really, they're the ones that prevent you from going forward. I talk about the goalkeeper, meaning the ones who help you make the goal. And the gatekeepers, I think we got to get rid of them. And that you'd use those examples in media. Because of those constraints, people found ways, creative ways. YouTube happened to democratize content because people couldn't get their shows greenlit.
So they're good, it's just not good for the gatekeeper.
It's not good for the gatekeeper, and they're usually the last ones hanging on because they believe they can control it. They don't want to change the way things are done. And they absolutely believe that it's always going to be that way. And then they wake up one day, and they're no longer, their gates really diminish. It's a small little gate, and everybody's stepping over it.
You're so entrepreneurial. I'm wondering why you stayed at GE for 27 years.
It took me writing a book to ask myself that too, to be honest. It was like my psychotherapy moment. I think in the end I realized two reasons. I just believed in the mission. This was a company. It's in a tough stock market state right now, but it's a really great company. It makes stuff that we need in the world. We need energy, we need health, we need transportation. How can you not be excited about that? There were all kinds of possibilities and connections if you're curious. But I also think I realized about myself, I just like the struggle. I like the struggle of trying to, just keep working at something, and you see an opportunity. And I was surprised when I reflected back that actually I liked that part of it. Whatever weird thing that says about me psychologically, I don't know.
But can I say, the grass is always greener, because being an entrepreneur is no picnic either. And then, it is really wonderful to have, and I miss that a bit, is to have that kind of the resources of a big institution and the brand and all that. So you've seen both sides, but you've chosen the entrepreneurial path. I go back and forth. I think being entrepreneurial like you were within a large organization is really challenging, but is the best of both worlds for the right person, because I think you've done such a great job of being the translator and being able to bring the outside ideas in, help create that constructive conflict. But that's not easy.
But I don't like conflict. I'm not an extroverted person. Those things are, but it's not because I liked doing those necessarily. They were necessary, I think. This year for me has been a very entrepreneurial year. I left my company somewhat abruptly at the end of last year. I thought I'd be leaving later, but I knew I was going to be leaving at some point. So it was an abrupt departure. Yeah. I put this book, which is, I have to spin up a little company to do it, and it's hard.
It's really hard.
It's hard. I have 5 versions of a website.
And it's be lonely, right? Because you don't have a team.
It's incredibly lonely, and I think that's the joy of a company, is knowing you're with a great team. I remember, my first month, I was sitting and I would have this little to-do list. And one day my husband came by, the desk I was working, and he goes, "What do you have to do? Why do you need a to-do list?" But it's sort of those habits, the ritual of, you just wanted to feel like I was efficient, and I have a purpose, and it was my to-do list, and it's wandering around, and I didn't fully give myself a full gap year this year, and that's what I'm hoping I can do now.
Give yourself a gap 3 years.
A gap 3 years.
So would you tell us about your 16-year-old self?
It's funny you asked that because I recently was clearing out a bunch of stuff and I found my 14-year-old self. I found a report that I did called Everything You Want to Know About Beth Comstock, Asterisk, But Were Afraid to Ask. And trust me, there was nothing riveting that you would have gotten out of it or been afraid to ask. But what I found in there that it really touched me about myself was that when I was 14, I wrote, I'm so ambitious. I want to be 50 different things in my life. And I was like, wow, I've always been that, you know, and I'm going to own the ambition. And I like that about me, that I've been ambitious and that I've been interesting. Okay, then I went on to say I want to be a lawyer. I think that must have been that one day. I wanted to be a doctor. So I had all these other things that I never really did, but I think that curiosity was probably always there too. I was a bit of a nerdy kind. I was good at school. I always had my nose in a book. My mom was very outgoing, and she kind of pushed me to be a joiner, to belong to clubs. So I think that helped me kind of be much more connected with people than I might have been on my own.
Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Winchester, Virginia. It was then a small town in Virginia in the Shenandoah Valley. I just went to my high school reunion this weekend. It was amazing to see people after I hadn't been in a while.
Did people buy your book?
Pardon me?
Did people buy your book?
They did, and some people asked me to sign it, which was nice. But mostly I wanted to, you want to connect it. It made me think about what did we think when we were 18 the future would be? And has it turned out for us? What I felt missing as we're like listening to Leonard Skinner or something again. I went to school in Virginia. In the background was I didn't get to hear their stories. I didn't, it was more like catching up, but I really wanted to go deep, like the questions you're asking. Did you think you were going to be doing this? What was the joy you didn't expect? And so those are the kind of things that I think now as we think about sort of toggling between the past and the future. And I think we all owe ourselves a bit of that discovery to go back and say, what was I like? And remind yourself there's a part of you that's always there, and you needed that to push you to the future.
So what do you think that's going to look like, and how are you going to find it? What's your path going to be?
Well, I feel like my kind of working life so far has been, largely I talk about in the book, social courage, kind of getting out of my own way, getting out of kind of what held me back, giving myself permission to move forward. To me, the next section has to be about more creative courage, more how do I express myself more? I'm untethered, I'm not connected to a company anymore. What does that mean? How do I do that? So I'm going to take the methods in my book. I'm going to go out, I'm going to give myself permission to try things. I think I'm going to offer myself out as an intern for different organizations, just try different things, maybe work for an artist.
It's hard to be a beginner. I mean, I love being a beginner because then the expectations are low, but I think just by nature we all want to be experts, and so
that's I actually
really
don't.
Exciting.
I don't want to be an expert. I don't want to have responsibility.
Yeah.
I want to take the experience I have. I went to an artist recently and I said, I'd love to be an intern here. Like, I want to just cut paper. He does collage. Like, I just want to cut paper. Just let me cut paper and then I'll see things and help you. He goes, okay, great. I'd like a business plan. I'd like a fundraising campaign. I'm like, no, that's not, what intern do you know can do that? So I do think channeling that beginner's mind.
Well, that's the thing is like picking something where people don't have expectations is wonderful. And then picking something where they kind of have the certain expectation of you being really good at it. And that's like, you're falling into the trap again.
Yeah, I know. So I think what I'll do is just, give myself permission to try things, discover. And I think you're right, though. I think I have worked for all these years for something. I mean, I should be able to translate it into something. What do I do with that? I'm going to kind of take my book advice and try to apply it to myself. We'll see if it works. I'll let you know.
I want to throw it out to questions to the audience. In 1 second, I'm just going to ask one more, is if you had one piece of advice for, actually, how many of you are entrepreneurs? Raise your hand. Okay. So maybe about 40%. And how many of you are employees? Not mutually exclusive. Almost everybody.
Well, can you raise both hands and say I'm an entrepreneur and an employee? Because that's what I would have been doing.
Absolutely. And so I think that even entrepreneurs, a lot of them are employees, right? And so often we hear these stories about leadership and innovation and how to be innovative from a position of leadership. But the truth is that the vast majority of people are not their employees first. So how do you make change in an organization from below?
Yeah, I love that question, and you're exactly right. We think it's just the CEO comes in and says, we will change this way, and everybody says, yes, sir, let's go. Rarely because the CEO says it, does anyone do it. Usually they try to find their way to not do what the CEO does, and I learned that painfully in the beginning going out, well, Jeff said, they're like, screw you, I don't care. So yeah, I'm a big believer in just this sort of basic kind of tried and true advice that really works. It's behavior science. It's change starts with you. And I think we have to look at corporate climates, company climates as sort of the big global climate. And each of us in our teams has sort of our microclimate. And so we can really only affect the bigger if we kind of change what we can within our own team, within ourselves. It's the giving yourself permission, making sure you have the vision clear. You repeat it over and over. It's a story. You're giving people room to test and learn, to discover. All those things are critical. You don't need permission to tell your team you're going to do that. Your team could be you and somebody else. It doesn't have to be 50 people, 500 people. So I'm convinced that's how change starts. With one of the groups I worked with, we came up with what we called our culture club. And it was really that contract we had with each other. The only way we can change the culture is starting with the culture we're responsible for. And we held ourselves responsible for answering a question like, tell me something I don't want to hear. And so one of the times, and it was multi-experience, multi-level in the organization, they came back to me the first time I asked that question, and they said, you know what, one, you're all over the place. You like every new idea you've ever met. You need to filter better. So I realized that some of my curiosity was dragging the team down. The second thing they said is you talk about failure, but we don't feel really like you mean it. And so you're demanding and help us. And so they came up with something called Fail Convention, FailCon for short, where we kind of celebrated our failures. It required them saying that to me, and then me sharing failures and making that happen. I didn't need to go to Jeff Immelt. I didn't need to go to HR and say, can we host an official FailCon here and make this happen? It totally transformed our culture in that respect.
Awesome.
And it became something we owned. That's what you can do in your little microclimate.
I used to have on performance reviews, although they would be annual, I have to admit, but where we would ask, like, in the last year, what mistakes did you make, or what failures did you have, and what did you learn from it, and actually call it out. And that I had somebody, I didn't realize how important that was. I had one of my team members tell me that completely changed the way he felt able to make failure, because
you gave him permission, right?
It was not only permission, it was like, you're required to report on a failure, and that really helped.
Yeah, so you were really the prompt to make that happen.
Yeah.
And why are we so afraid of failure? Like you said earlier, it's almost a cliche, and it's the whole startup, like, fail fast, fail small, like, it's like 5 sit-ups in the morning, and then I go. Failure's really hard, and we don't talk about it because we're afraid, because we're short-term focused, because we want to know the answer, all those things. And so how many people do you come across that say, yeah, failure is part of my culture, and then you dig in, no one's asking what you're asking. No one's asked that question.
But I'm really impressed that your team, you said, tell me something I don't want to hear.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of executives that might say that. They may get to that point of saying that, but still the team doesn't feel safe telling you. So the fact that they told you is pretty important.
But you're right. The first time what they did is they nominated the nicest guy on the team, and he came in and he said something really, like, sweet, like, you know, like,
you work too hard.
Yeah, exactly. You know, you're a perfectionist or something.
Yeah.
And it was like, no, like, you really got to give it to me, right? And so that's also that feedback loop. You have to say, no, that's not enough. Help me understand it. You have to ask for that. And they had to see I was sincere and that I was going to take action on it, because that's the other thing you do is you ask and then you don't do anything about it. And then people are like, well, thanks for nothing.
Yeah, for sure. So, questions.
All right, so I will bring the microphone to anyone who has a question. Just a quick reminder around here, questions, I like to say, start with a W or an H, sometimes a D. They are generally short. There is no such thing as a two-part question, and only Krisztina gets to ask follow-up questions. So those rules.
I'm not going to start out by thanking you guys, because that would be against the rule. Awesome talk. Do you have any ideas for how to combat short-termism, which is prevalent, as you both discussed?
Well, I think some of what we were saying, I think you can adopt your behavior. I think for most companies, what I'd hope we could get to, and I think, again, you can start this in a team. I like some basic frameworks that you may know if you went to business school. I didn't, but I've picked these up, like just a portfolio of kind of 70-20-10. I love that as a framework. 70% of the team's people, time, money focused on the now. 20 on what's next, stuff you already see, but you're not exactly sure how it's going to manifest, and then the 10% on what's new. I love that as a way to kind of keep track of what you're working on. I think that's helpful. I think just making sure that the team, I've always tried to grab 10 to 15% of my budget, whatever budget I had, and again, my company was cheap. It's not like we had a lot of money. Even if your budget's just your time, can you take that 10% of your time to do experiments, to come and find new partnerships, to put it towards some of that discovery of those things? So those things you can control, can you try to make that happen? Share it with your team. I think different metrics are also helpful in short-termism. It's really about leadership, and I worry a lot. We've kind of turned a lot of this over to the investment world, saying, well, our investors just won't let us. And some of that's true. I'm not naive enough to say, I mean, I look at GE right now in a tough place because of a lot of investor anxiety around that. I think they were patient for a while. But I do think you have to be very clear to your investors that says, this is what we're planting for the future. So those would be some of the things, and hopefully on an individual level, you're just constantly kind of making that space that shows you're thinking about the future. How would you answer that? What do you see?
This is really hard, and I don't know. I mean, I think that you do have some good examples. I think that it's even a problem with startups too. You know, I mean, I think there are very few startups that are in a position to really take huge risks. You were saying that if you have too much funding, then that could be a problem in a startup. But at the same time, if you only have 10 million and you need to become $100 million exit in 5 years, then what can you really accomplish?
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
you can't take big risks.
I mean, look at Elon Musk and Tesla right now. I think what is it? Popular Science, I think, has an article, a cover story that I totally agree with. Just he's doing hard stuff. Take Musk and whatever his leadership style is out of the equation. Tesla's a hard problem.
Yeah.
And now they're a public company and they're being held to a different scrutiny. Do companies get reset moments when they need to lean in and do these things differently? Certainly the Tesla investors don't seem to be willing to let that happen. And I think we have to. So I would worry about that for us, even in these newer companies.
It hasn't always been that there's a view that the company's leadership has, like, number one priority is to return for the shareholders right away. I mean, that really happened in the early 70s.
Yeah, it really, there was that shift from the 70s to the 80s, and the 80s, and I mean, the company I worked for, that was Jack Welch's, that was the thing. It was about returning shareholder value.
So we should look back on what was it about the values, can we go back to those values of before?
It's interesting, I'm not an expert, but I've been doing a little bit of cursory research, and in the 70s, it was a lot of stakeholders around the table for companies, and as I understand it, investors felt they didn't have enough of a seat at the table. So there was a movement to bring more investors in to give them a seat at the table, and maybe they just got greedy at the seats.
Kind of sense.
Yeah, and so maybe we need, I think I believe we need activists who are activating for the is that right? Who are fighting for the future.
Yeah.
And I want to know, where are those activists? And look, we've got Silicon Valley, and where they're sending us to Mars. That's almost too far in the future. We need a kind of realistic future. Remember when we started Eco-Imagination, we dreamed with our customers out 10 years. And then you work your way back. I mean, imagine if we agitated a bit more for that kind of nearer-term future for our companies.
And that's been radically successful. I mean, I think it's generated $35 billion in
a year
value for GE. Is incredible.
Yeah, so, but you had to have that activism to say you believe
that future.
How long
did it take to get to that kind of a payoff?
It took to get to, I mean, within a couple of years, you were starting to see you were getting new revenue from new sources, but it took a good 10 years to get to that.
Yeah. Well, and here's the other thing, is that you mentioned not to take too big of a bet too early.
Yeah.
So if you do small investments up front and test and iterate, you're not investing it's not as big of a risk.
Yeah,
early on.
we didn't do that with the energy storage business, that we ended up investing $200 million and had to write it all off because we got to that immediate scale. We didn't validate that the tech worked. We didn't validate the customer or the business model. And immediately we built a huge factory and said, now fill it. And that's what you're saying happens to startups on your path to $100 million exit or whatever.
Yeah, definitely.
A question over here.
Hi, thanks for coming. You mentioned that GE did away last year with performance reviews.
Yeah.
I'm curious, can you talk more about how differentiation compensation-wise is actually done? A lot of people speculate there's a phantom performance rating on the back end for HR and management to use.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I'll remember at one point, or you may not know this, but at one point, GE had a kind of rank and yank process where if you were in the bottom 10, if you were rated in the bottom 10%, you were told to go home.
What if everyone kicks butt?
Well, they always had to find somebody who was the least of the
Pits everyone against each other.
Bottom 10% of the butt kickers had to go.
Yeah.
And the idea was you'd level up. I think that proved not to be, because again, it's back to meritocracy and who's setting the standards and who's judging it. So I think for what you're talking about, yeah, I think you do have to guard against some of those shadow rating systems because old behaviors die hard. I would say a lot of that, I don't have the longitudinal research to see how it all panned out because it was probably the last 4 or 5 years that I worked at GE that we got that going. A couple things I think you do look at is you get that overwhelming feedback data. So every individual employee knows how they're ranking just because of the feedback. Someone would come to me and say, you know, but I'm doing really well. I don't know why you think I'm suffering in that project. And I go, are you really? Have you done the feedback? What did your colleagues tell you? Surely I'm not telling you this as a surprise. So I do think, you know, and in the early stages, we had employees own their own data. It's not like as a manager, I could see what everybody had. And so they had to do some self-reporting in early days. So I do think it's a bit of empowerment and transparency that has to come with that. And then how do you differentiate? I think it's pretty clear when you get the feedback, who's doing well and who's not. You still have measurements. You still have metrics that you're accountable for. If you're in sales, you have sales targets. If you're in a product, you have targets. So you still have performance targets that you have to meet. And so you're triangulating some of that feedback data, the qualitative with the quantitative. It's not perfect. I think anyone can start that. I don't know if there's a venture capitalist in Silicon Valley. Do you know Fen Barnes at first round? Anyway, he has this great method I love where he, anytime you have a meeting with this guy, he sends out a Google survey or a Survey Monkey afterwards and asks you 3 questions. You know, was this meeting effective? Will you meet with me again? Is there any action coming out of that? So I always love that as just, I think any one of us can create our own feedback loops. You don't need to wait for the company to say that. I find that a lot for companies that are surprised when they have a culture surprise or disruption. Often they haven't been doing the pulsing. They might do an annual employee satisfaction survey. So I would try to work my way through some of those, but just figure it out as you go, as opposed to thinking you're going to have all those answers right up front. I don't know, hopefully that's helpful.
My question is, how do you think about the trade-off between perseverance and flexibility? When do you know when it's time to give up and kill a project?
Yeah, I wish I could give you a good answer on that because I am not one to give up on something. So there needs to be somebody else sitting up here who would give you that answer. That being said, I do think in companies what we do is we're not disciplined about calling something over because there's too much ego. It's my team against your team. I found companies will spend, if they have enough money to fund 3 ideas, they'll fund 5. They won't kill ideas early. We gravitated to a really good kind of venture capital model, which is just you're really testing and seeding ideas early, and you have a bit of a group of people that come together and make a decision. It's kind of like a board, an advisory board, and so you're not just leaving it up to one person who's maybe it's their pet project and they don't want to kill it. And then that decision is made, and you can't go back in and go, yeah, but I really like John over there. I really think John should get more money. Let's give him another year to go. No, we've made a decision. The vision still exists. So I guess I'd ask you, are you giving up on the vision, or you're giving up on the method. And I think you need to know the difference a bit there. So perseverance toward a vision, keep going. You're trying different things. You're trying to figure out what does and doesn't work. But maybe a particular path, you have to decide pretty quickly that doesn't work. And the goal is to spend the least amount of money to get to that decision. And that's what I feel like we frankly learned a little late, but I feel really it's a very powerful way to think about it.
That is really powerful. And I think maybe one of the other things that make it difficult is that individuals feel so tied to a particular project. And I remember I had a person working for me who helped start a couple of event things that we did. And there was another group on campus that wanted to own that for some reason. I'm like, great, that gives us the ability to then do the next thing. And he was really upset.
That's
and I
such a
was
great
so
example.
surprised. And he felt like it was being taken away from him and almost like his whole value is being questioned because now he's not running that.
Yeah.
And I said, no, it's even better when you can broaden your skills.
That's a great example. And that's why I think you want to be cycling through the ideas and the people that way. There's a group of people that are continually kind of vetting and seeding that. And again, if you believe in that vision, to your point, you don't care who's in there making it happen. You just want to get it done. It's not my idea, it's this opportunity. So maybe you're shifting your mindset a bit too.
Yeah, I think that people have felt very fearful that their position is at risk or because it's just been beaten into them, their whole careers.
Yeah. But I think the perseverance issue, I think knowing your exit strategy is part of the journey, and you just need to have these really serious discussions. What's changed? Is the time right? Do I have enough evidence to just say this is not going to happen now? And maybe just put it aside for a time too. So perseverance might be just taking a pause. And I think that sometimes is hard too.
Interesting.
We have time for 2 questions.
Could you talk a little bit about some of the most effective marketing campaigns or initiatives at GE during your time there?
I would say I thought our Eco-Imagination effort was good because we took a very optimistic view of a future, and sort of put it out there that there could be this clean world. And also we were very open and transparent in saying we're not there yet. Hold us accountable. We invited in a lot of NGOs and other people. They were part of the story. When we were looking at the digitization of industry, we were making a market. That was probably the hardest job, where you're saying the industrial internet. Like, huh? Who cares? And so I think for that one, it was making a market, saying, here's the opportunity. It was a lot about vision. Imagine if your jet engine tweeted. What would it tell you? So it was a lot of storytelling. It was a lot of outcome. That would be the commonality between eco and industrial internet. What's the outcome? In eco, it was ecological and economical. You were going to have a cleaner world, and you were going to not go broke doing it. And in industrial internet, it was all about productivity. Your question makes me think about, I'm on the board of Nike, and I've been really impressed with the work they've done lately in Just Do It. And I think the work they've done, not just the Colin Kaepernick, which got a lot of attention, but they've had Serena Williams, they've had LeBron James. I think right now in the world, brands have to have a lot of courage. Those 2 examples I used, I like them because I feel we were courageous. We were putting our head out there, saying something at a time that it wasn't popular or no one knew what we were talking about. Nike's doing that right now by saying sports can be about social justice. And it's been controversial, but they know their consumer. They know what they stand for. And so that's maybe the filter I'd urge you to think about when you're judging. To me, at least, what's a good marketing campaign is you're connecting with a consumer need, you're courageous in seeing an opportunity and sticking forward. And marketing's much bigger than brand, but that was just what you made me think about.
And our final question for the evening.
Do you have any advice on engaging colleagues to drive change?
On leading colleagues to direct change?
Engaging them.
Engaging them. Yeah, just tell them to. That works, right? Anyone who has a partner, that never works. My husband, we're still renovation projects for each other. I've come to the conclusion that your job is just to create a surround sound of change opportunities for people. You cannot force anyone to change. What's your job? Your job is to be that outsider, constantly translating the trends, bring it back almost like a golden retriever. Look at what I found. Let me translate it for you. I love bringing in sparks from the outside so you don't have to do that. If somebody has some bad news to bring in about a disruption that's happening, they can beat them up, not you. And your job is to translate it. And then just create these, I love learning labs and experiences. When we were trying to do 3D printing, we just dropped 3D printing machines in the most sophisticated engineering pods in the company. Did some games, said, see what you come up with. And it was amazing that there was always an early adopter, a curious tribe that grabs those. So give people space to kind of come to grips with it on their own. Those are some of the things I've found helpful. Ask questions. What would happen if this were to go this way? Not come in, I definitively know, this is my idea, we must do this, because then people get defensive. Those are some of the things I've seen helpful.
It's been really fantastic.
Thank you, you do such a
be
great
with
job,
you
really. Thanks for the
and just-
opportunity. Thanks.
Yeah, just hear your great insights and your stories.